This is my kid Genie storybook. Thank you. Okay, my TEAC objectives. First off, is one for English 1 of grade 9, 4E. Students will create meaning in texts using metacognition and by making personal connections and developing relationships between text and to the other students' personal experience and to society. My second TEAC objective is one from Algebra 1 in the 9th grade. Students will manipulate expressions and use representations to organize, record, and communicate mathematical ideas. So I created my Kid Genie account and then watched the tutorial, and I found out that there's a lot of interesting ways to create media, and I found it really fascinating, such as drawing sketches and basically generating stories from using various prompts and writing books. I think it's a very, very helpful way to generate media for literacy learning at any grade level. I selected a high school level ELA reading concerning Martin Luther and his life and his journey, okay, leading him up to becoming a Protestant monk. Okay, so the life of him and putting it into a form of a memoir. And I thought it just something that would be appropriate for a high school level reader to learn about a personal narrative or memoir. And then I chose an informational text for the content area I will be teaching for 9th grade. Okay, and this is to understand the properties and laws of algebra. Okay, so my first prompt was to create a memoir written for a 9th grade level considering the life of Martin Luther in the form of an autobiography about his life and his journey through life as a student until becoming a Protestant church leader and reformer of the Catholic Church. Okay, I chose this prompt since it was an appropriate piece, and it also integrates with history lesson on the Reformation of Europe and his main role in the Reformation. And I think it's interesting because it discusses a style of writing known as a memoir. It's a personal narrative written by the author. So it's a personal narrative of the author himself writing about a particular story concerning his life and his experiences. So it's written from the perspective of the author, and it's a personal narrative. That is what a memoir is, and it's good to be able to teach this style of writing to a high school student. So it's a perfect example for to be able to study this style of writing. The second prompt, okay, we create an informational text that teaches the 3 laws of algebra: associative, commutative, and distributive law for 9th grade algebra students, teaching them with examples and definitions of the 3 laws. Okay, I chose this prompt for my content area story since I'll be a teacher of high school level math, and I might want to be put into a 9th grade algebra classroom, and I want to make sure the students are very familiar with those 3 properties, or what they call algebraic laws, when manipulating and simplifying expressions. So I find this very helpful, this lesson, to be able to use a storybook for this kind of lesson, to be able to teach the laws or properties of algebra when trying to simplify various expressions. So my first storybook, here's the link, and it reads, growing up in the small town of Eisleben, I never imagined the path my life would take. In my early years, the world around me was filled with strict rules and traditions dictated by the Catholic faith of the time. As a curious child, I often questioned these teachings, but it was not until my university days that the seeds of doubt began to take root. My journey as a student at the University of Erfurt was both invigorating and challenging, consumed by an unquenchable thirst for knowledge. I found solace in the world of books. However, it was a frightening experience during a thunderstorm that truly redirected my path. In sheer terror, I vowed to become a monk if I survived the storm. The decision led me to the Augustinian monastery, where my spiritual struggles intensified. Encounters with the harsh reality of Catholic doctrine left me disheartened. In 1517, when the church began selling indulgences to fund the grandiose St. Peter's Basilica, I felt a burning need to take a stand. Thus I would nail my 95 thesis to the door of the Wittenberg Castle Church, not knowing this act of defiance would spark a revolution. This moment was the birth of the Reformation, but with change came great turmoil. The clash with the Catholic Church was not only a battle of ideologies, but also a personal journey towards understanding faith and truth. As I began translating the Bible into German, I aimed to make its wisdom accessible to all, allowing individuals to form their own connections with the divine. Reflections on my life, I'm humbled by the weight of the transformation that emerged from my simple quest for truth. With every step I took, I realized reform was not merely changing protocols, but nurturing the soul's journey for authenticity. And so, I leave you with this. What new revelation might arise if one continued this journey for truth and reform in today's world? So that's my reading of this first storybook. And now I'm going to discuss the first storybook's teaching points. Okay, so I would begin by explaining the style of writing this story concerning the life of Martin Luther was. So I would explain this piece is known as a memoir. So I want to basically give the students a definition of the memoir and explain that it's a narrative written from the perspective of the author. So I want them to have knowledge of what a memoir is and use the story as an example to show them what this kind of style of writing looks like. Okay. After reading the story, I would ask the students what adjectives could describe this man. So as Martin Luther submitted to the faith, what is their reflection on Martin Luther King? How could they reflect on his actions? How would they describe his actions as good or bad or faithful or pious? Whatever word they want to use, I would like them to find some kind of adjective to describe Martin Luther King as he submitted to the faith. I would cover several vocabulary terms: invigorating, divine, reformation, and revelation. And then I would ask the students to basically make a personal connection to the story, that what would they do in the instance that Martin Luther King was in. So if they were in Martin Luther King's place, how would they respond to a situation like that? So they can make a personal connection to the story and be able to have their own understanding of it from the perspective of their own lives. The second storybook. Okay, here's the link. And then this is concerning ninth grade algebra. In a vibrant land of numbers and equations, there were three magical laws that governed the realm of algebra: the associative, commutative, and distributive laws. These laws were taught by the wise math magician to all the new students who entered the kingdom. Firstly, the math magician spoke of the associative law, which told tales of how numbers grouped together in addition or multiplication could be rearranged without changing their collective power. He demonstrated with an enchanted sequence: 2 plus 3 in parentheses plus 4 is the same as 2 plus 3 plus 4 in parentheses. And similarly for multiplication, 2 times 3 in parentheses times 4 is the same as 2 times 3 times 4 in parentheses. Next, he introduced the commutative law, which granted the freedom to swap places in addition or multiplication. Numbers like 4 plus 5 were at home equally as 5 plus 4. Multiplying bravely followed suit. 6 times 7 became 7 times 6 with no change in the outcome. Okay. Lastly, the distributive law showed its magic by taking a number outside the bracket on an adventurous journey inside. A times in parentheses b plus c became distributing a to b and then distributing a to c. A times b plus a times c. Numbers danced in harmony, as powerful together as they were apart. With these laws, students expanded their adventures with numbers beyond imagination. But as they learned, a question lingered. What more wonders lay in the unexplored territories of algebra's enchanted lands? Okay, and this is my second storybook's teaching points. Okay, so after reading the story to the students, I would review each property and show them how it is used in mathematics, so they understand the use in mathematics and how to use it in manipulating algebraic expressions or simplifying them. Basically, when and how this property is used. Okay, I would explain. I would make a point about how these laws only apply to the operations of multiplication and addition, and that they do not apply to subtraction and division of terms. And a term being a mathematical unit that's added or subtracted, only with multiplication and addition do these properties apply. And I would go over the important vocabulary: commutativity, associativity, distributivity. And I'd also introduce equation, expression, and term, so they would have an understanding of how these properties of algebra are used to manipulate various expressions. And lastly, I would give the students an opportunity to give some of their own expression examples by writing them down on paper. So I'd let them, kind of tinker with these properties and come up with a couple of expressions and how they would be able to manipulate them according to the laws of these properties, so that they could correctly rewrite expressions in algebra. My reflection. Okay. Since I will be teaching at the high school level, perhaps in the ninth grade, Algebra 1, I chose a relevant topic from both ELA and mathematics at the ninth grade level, so Algebra 1. So I would have the experience with stories at that grade level, since that's the grade level I would like to teach. Okay, my prompts were concise, but with enough description to cover the topics that were appropriate for ninth grade students in ELA and Algebra 1. With ELA prompt, I wanted the students to review a memoir from a historical figure, and in Algebra 1, I wanted my students to learn the basic properties of algebra. So I felt like my prompts were concise, they were well written and worded, so that I could fully get the full content of the story that I wanted. Okay. The prompts generated stories that were relatable, enjoyable to read, and make connections too. Okay, especially with the Martin Luther King, the Martin Luther story. Martin Luther, the Protestant reformer. Basically, there was a lot of interesting ways to ask questions and guide students' reading and comprehension in the story, being able to make connections to the stories, and also they also use a lot of analogies in the algebraic property story, making it easy to understand the various laws with the language that was used. The prompts generated stories that were even as relatable and enjoyable as they were. There were some distractions to teaching directly what is needed for the students to understand. Okay, there was lots of colorful language. There was lots of kind of distracting points. It kind of, especially with that math example, that math story with the properties of algebra, it made very, very colorful points, lots of description, lots of fancy kind of wording and stuff in the story, which I could see might lead to some distraction for the students instead of just basically showing them how the property works. However, it being as entertaining as it was, I can see how it's very relatable and very relevant to student interest and things like that. So I think that's probably a good thing or a positive aspect. However, I could see a little bit of distraction in some of the stories. Otherwise, I don't find much negative about the stories. I could adapt both stories to my classroom, especially with the language arts story. Okay, it gave a very good example of what a memoir is. Okay, a memoir, a personal narrative. So I could use this story to help my students understand that style of writing. So a memoir. Okay, and if I were to use these prompts in the future, I wouldn't change much about the memoir, but maybe change the features of the algebraic property story. Okay, some of the small analogies and creative language that was used is a little bit kind of misleading or a little bit confusing and makes it sound basically gives the student the wrong idea of what's going on in the commutative property. They used some language that such as the numbers jump in. They used some of the language such as granted freedom to swap. And in the property, the numbers aren't swapping with each other. Like they're not swapping. They are swapping places, but it's not like that number takes the place of the other number. It's actually more like numbers to jump in front and behind the other. So I would maybe change some of the language just to make it more clear as to what the story is actually trying to say. So since they're not actually swapping each other's place, they're just changing order in the expression. So I felt the Kid Genie story were very innovative and a unique way to present content and build student literacy. The prompts I chose generated creative, expressive, and very insightful stories in both categories of ELA story and algebra story. Categories of the ELA story and the algebra story. I love the kind of language that was used to connect students to a variety of law definitions, exemplifying what they mean and how they work in the algebraic property story. I also love the perfect example of the EL story gave of the memoir or personal narrative in order to give the students more of a feel for that style of writing. Okay. The story generator accurately gave you the stories you gave the prompt for, and I really enjoyed this project. And I think it was a really fascinating project, and it did a good job generating the kind of story with the content you wanted it to have.